If you're developing RESTful APIs with Python, your team needs a standardized way to document and to test those APIs, maybe even generate some code for them. And that's where OpenAPI and Swagger comes in, which is exactly what I want to talk to you about in this tutorial. Give me just a few minutes of your time, and I'm going to show you how to integrate Swagger and OpenAPI with your existing Python applications. I'm going to show you a little bit about that OpenAPI specification. I might even show you how to generate some code based on what goes into that OpenAPI spec. But in order to document a RESTful API in Python, we need a RESTful API in Python. So quickly creating a little Flask application, that is what we're going to do next. Now, in order to document a RESTful API in Python, we need a RESTful API in Python. So I'm going to quickly create a simple Flask application with really just one endpoint in it for now. You can see that I've got VS Code opened up right here. I got a little virtual environment in my Swagger project, and I'm going to do a little bit of pipping right now. I'm going to install Flask, Flask Swagger UI, and also Flask cores. There's a bit of a shout out to Anheuser-Busch here. We're going to need cores in order to test our RESTful API from the online Swagger editor. It's a pretty cool little trick, so stick around and make sure you see that. So I'm going to say pip list after all of that is done and see what comes up in my pip list. And you can see I got Flask cores, I got Flask Swagger UI. It's dangerous, we all know that. And we also have Flask. Where is Flask? Sitting around right there. I almost thought I missed it, but just got to scroll up a little bit. So, okay, that is good. We are kicking with gas right now. Cooking with gas right now. The next thing we probably need to do is just create our little Flask application. So I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be a Python file. I'll do a little file, save as, and give it the name Swagger Flask.py. I didn't really think too much about that name, but that should work. And what are we going to do here? Well, I guess we got to do the requisite imports, right? You know, you got a Flask application, you got to import what? You got to import Flask, maybe JSONify, maybe render templates. Those all are pretty good. You know, I don't even know if I'm going to need JSONify here, not to begin with, but maybe we'll get to that later. So I'll leave it in there. We're also, in order to support Swagger, we need a Swagger blueprint that tells Python how to configure Swagger, how to start it up, how to put a path together for Swagger. So we're going to import that. And also a little shout out to Anheuser-Busch. We're going to have a little bit of Coors here. We're going to turn off that cross-origin scripting error that comes up. That's going to come in handy when we do some testing. So stick around for that. Now, what else do we have to do? I mean, again, this is not a Flask tutorial. If you've done any RESTful API development, you always know that you just initialize the Flask environment, call it app. Here I'm going to pass app into that cores object, that cores resource, so that cores will be turned off. And then from there, what do? Well, this RESTful API, we're going to start off, and it's just going to have one route to it. Route? I'm not too sure how I'm supposed to pronounce that. I'm a Canadian, so we pronounce everything correctly. Just do as I say. And the route's just going to be a health check, right? So it's just going to be a health check. That is going to be the path. It's going to be a get invocation. So I don't even have to say that the HTTP request type is get. The method will be health check, which again isn't that creative. And when somebody says, hey, give me a health check on the application, we're just going to return a simple text string. We're going to say, you know, it's a big snafu, which of course stands for situation normal, all fired up. Okay, at least that's the Christian version of it anyways. Now, if you've ever written a Python application, you know that you got to include that good old if name equals main element right there. If you don't do that, you will be in a world of hurt. So we're going to add that in. And there we go. That is just a simple Flask application. And if my fat fingers haven't done anything wrong, I can click on that beautiful triangle in the top right-hand corner. That should kick off my application. And once that's done, I should be able to come over here, open up a browser to localhost 5000/health check, and let's see what happens right here. Boom, situation normal, all fired up. So we do have a RESTful API that is working. However, it's not documented and we're not testing it in Swagger. So jumping into the OpenAPI specification, that is exactly what we're going to do next. At the heart of all of the Swagger tools is the OpenAPI specification. You can come over to editor.swagger.io, although that domain name may change. The country that the IO domain is based on apparently sank into the ocean or something like that. So apparently that is going to change, but it works for now. When you come over here, you're presented with an extensive specification that describes the Swagger pet store. You're never going to learn all of the Swagger OpenAPI specification. It's not hard to learn, it's just extensive, but you know, it's also structured and it's predictable. And as software developers, structured and predictable is all we want. We want to document that RESTful API that we just created, /health check on get. How would we do that? Well, you can always go to ChatGPT and ask it to spit out some OpenAPI specification, or you can come here and you can kind of find maybe a path that looks like yours. So there looks like a /pet find by status. If I dig in here, you can see, oh, it describes, you know, how maybe a get invocation might look. This one's got some parameters. It does have a response code that's JSON. You can kind of go in here, take a look at how the API is structured, and then go in and create your own. How do you create your own? Well, you just come in here, you clear everything out, and then you start typing in your own specification and seeing if what you type in is valid. So I've kind of prepared a little bit of a description of our API. I'm going to say we're going to use OpenAPI 3 and some of the info to describe our application. We're going to be working on a rock, paper, scissors application. So this is the score API and it's version 1. Now, you'll notice that Swagger doesn't like this. It says there's an error there. It says, hey, you can't have a Swagger API without a path in it. And this is good, right? Because you can start typing in your own specification here, your own open API description of your REST APIs. And if you type something wrong in, well, it'll tell you about it. So it's barking at me here. And I'm going to say, you know what? Okay, one of the things I do want to add in is I want to specify what URL the application works on. And as you can see, it responds right away. It says, yeah, that's great. Okay, that's good information I have, but you still haven't told me about the path. And I'm like, okay, don't be so darn persnickety. And then I'll come in here and I'll describe my path. I'll say that my path is /health check. It works over the get HTTP request. And if everything's good, we'll send a 200 response code back along with a little bit of a text string. Now it does say it's a plain text string. I find it a little insulting. I think the text string is pretty clever and creative, but I don't know, it does look like it is a little judgmental. Now here's the other cool thing. You'll see that the Swagger UI has come up right away and it said, hey, there's a get invocation on localhost 5000. It says, do you want to try that out? And I'm like, well, this is an online tool. I mean, I can't really try it out, right? That's not really gonna work, right? But I click it anyways and it says, okay, test me. Click execute. So I can't resist a beautiful blue button. So I'm going to click execute right there and boom, look what happens. I get a 200 request and it says snafu, situation normal, all fired up. Because I put that CORS entry in there, this online editor can actually run and hit localhost 5000 and I actually get a response from my actual application. That is pretty darn cool if you ask me. Now, this is running online, and of course, you don't want to run this all online. You probably don't want to put your entire API specification online just in case there's some stuff that is secure or private. So the next step is taking this, all of this stuff that worked, and actually bringing it into our Python application. And that is exactly what we're going to do next. So we've got Swagger UI in our Python Flask application integrated online, but we want this local. We want this inside of our own environment. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing we need to do is actually download this YAML file. So I'm going to click Save as YAML. That's going to throw this into my downloads folder, and I actually want that into a folder called static here in my project. So I'm going to create a folder called static, and it's called static because it sticks to your clothes when you pull it out of the dryer. So we'll throw that right into the dryer there, and now we've got our OpenAPI YAML spec inside of our application. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to tell our server, we need to tell our application to start OpenAPI, start the Swagger UI when it kicks off. Now there's a couple of pieces of information that we need to provide in order for that to happen. The first thing we need to do is we need to tell the Swagger UI where the YAML file is. And of course, it's not called swagger.yaml, it's called openapi.yaml. And it's not spopenapi.yaml, it's openapi.yaml. I told you I got fat fingers. So that's the first thing we want to do. The next thing, you can always specify what the URL is going to be. And for Swagger UI, we want it to be localhost 5000/API/doc. So we're going to specify that URL as well. And then finally, well, not finally, because there's actually a couple of things to do after this, but after we've specified those two things, we're going to create a Swagger UI blueprint. And this Swagger UI blueprint just basically describes how Swagger is going to work. So here's the Swagger URL. Here's the URL for the API. And then you can specify some overrides. So we'll set app name to RPS, rock, paper, scissors, because eventually I'm going to be creating a RESTful API in Python and Flask that keeps track of the score in a rock, paper, scissors game. Okay, I told you we're not quite done, but we're close to done. The next thing we do is just register that blueprint. And with that blueprint registered, boom, I think we are raring to go and test this thing out. I'm going to do a slow scroll here so you can see the from element, apps, the cores. Probably don't need cores anymore. We do have the API URL and Swagger URL. The blueprint is loaded. And then everything else is exactly the same as it was before. As I like to say, it's exactly the same, except it's different. So we should be able to mosey on over here. I'm going to click that play button just to make sure that everything is running. That can't hurt. And then once that's all started up, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to test this out. Local host 5000/health check. The health check is working, but that's not what we want. We want Swagger, and that's API/docs. And boom, all of a sudden the Swagger UI comes out. It says, hey, do you want to test that get invocation? I'm like, yeah, I want to try it out. And it says, okay, well, click this blue button. I'm like, okay, I will execute, even though that does sound very medieval French, Middle Ages, but okay, we will execute. And then all of a sudden it says situation normal, all fired up. And I think that's pretty darn cool. We've now got this whole thing working locally. Now, we're not done yet. I want to show you actually how to add a couple of extra annotations to your specification for a couple more endpoints. And then this is the big payoff pitch. I'm going to show you how you can actually get OpenAPI to generate a bunch of Python code for you so you don't have to write all the code yourself. That is one of the coolest things of Swagger, and that is what we're going to do next. Now let's up our game just a little bit here. Your RESTful APIs are going to have more than just get methods that send back text. More likely than not, they're going to be pulling some JSON from a database or NoSQL. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a variable called score, and the score is essentially going to represent an in-memory database that keeps track of the wins, losses, and ties in our application. And the idea is somebody in our application is going to want to get the score. So I'm going to add in a new method here, app.route/score. The method is get. I'm including that this time. I didn't do it with a health check, but it's not a bad thing to do. And the method here, just get score, is going to return the JSONification of that score. Just a real simple method that sends the score down to the client. So that's one thing that we'll commonly do in a RESTful API. Take an object, take a piece of JSON and send it to the client. The opposite will often happen as well. The client may send JSON to us. So our application is actually going to support a put operation that will send data to the server and store some data on the server. And so here's a couple of new routes that our application is going to have. /score for a get invocation, /score for a put invocation, and specifically the get just returns the score. In contrast, the put operation, that pulls the score in. It gets JSON from the client. It pulls the JSON out of the request, and then it sets the score in this application. Those are two fairly interesting methods that are a lot more complicated than the simple get invocation on health check. Now they're added, but they're not documented. Documenting them is what we're going to do next. So we are now playing this Swagger OpenAPI Python Flask game on expert level because we've got some components that we're pulling in from the client on a put invocation and sending back to them on a get for /score. How do we document this in OpenAPI? Well, the first thing we need to do is tell OpenAPI about that score object. You've got to go in there and you've actually got to document the components that you create. And the component document, it actually goes right at the bottom here. And I'm going to paste in the component details. I might even throw a couple of carriage. Do you kids even know what a carriage return is? Call back to my old typewriter days. A couple of enters in there. And I'm going to describe these components. Well, there's one component. It's called the score. It's an object, and it has three required fields: wins, losses, and ties, each of which are of type integer. It represents the number of wins, the number of losses, and looks like on the ties there, I didn't do the copy and pasting properly, and I didn't put in the description, but this is the beauty of optional fields. Now, here's the other cool thing. If I come over here and scroll down a little bit, the schema now includes the fact that, well, this API uses a score and even gives a little details here. It says there's wins, there's losses, and ties. And you know what? The wins just represents the number of wins in the game that the player is playing. But we've now documented the actual component here. Now, when we document the put and the get operations, we're going to actually link to that, because we're going to say a get operation sends that component back and a put operation needs that component pulled in. And here is how we do it. I'm going to document the get operation first. I'm going to head up here to where the path is for health check. Now you always have to be careful here when you do this. I'm going to paste in /score. Does it all line up? Yes, it does. And what I'm going to say here is that this /score endpoint works on a get invocation. And when somebody asks to get that score, what we're going to do is we're going to return some JSON to them. That's the content that gets sent back. And what JSON are we going to send back to them? Well, refer to line 28 there and 29 where it talks about the /score. That's what line 26 is telling us. So we're actually saying when that runs, what we're going to send back to the user is the score. And we can do exactly the same thing, except do it differently with the put operation. It's one of my favorite sayings. It's exactly the same. It's just completely different. So here is the put operation. Now, I've got to make sure those are lined up right. So for the score, there's also going to be a put operation. That put operation will map to an operation called put score. The request body will include information, right? So the request body, when somebody does a put, they're going to be sending JSON as part of the request body to the server. It is required, right? We can't change the score, update the score, create a new score object on the server without that data being there. And what data is coming in as JSON? Well, the data that's referred to down there on line 42 under the schemas, it's referring to the score. That is the information that's going to be coming in. And of course, if everything works swimmingly, well, the response is going to be a 200 success code. So there we go. We now have our API documented. What's next? We'll just copy all of that. I will swagger on into my Swagger file, Control V, and throw that in. Why do I have the number of ties all the way down there? Does that look good? I think I might need to work on my copy and paste skills because I don't think I copy and pasted everything. Oh, no, that all looks good. Copy. Paste everything in there. Click Control S. I'm going to go and take a look at my terminal, see what's going on down there. Everything looks good to me. Come over to my file. I'm going to click play here. And oh, it doesn't like my blueprint. Looks like I got a little bit of an error here. Look, I'm a Canadian. I said A at some point in time. I'm going to click play once again. Again, my fat fingers hitting the keyboard. I'm going to mosey on over here back to my application. I'm going to click refresh. And when I refresh, you'll notice that, well, we have that get operation, but we also have a put operation on score and get on score. I'm going to give this put operation a try. It looks like that's what the JSON's got to be structured at. I'm going to say, let's try this out. I'm going to set the number of wins to Wayne Gretzky. I'm going to set the number of ties to the greatest hockey player of all time, Mario Lemieux. I'm going to set the losses to Mario Lemieux. That's insulting. The ties to Tim Horton. I'm now going to click execute. Now, I don't know. Did that work? Does it say success? It does seem to say that everything was successful, but you know where I'm from. I'm from Missouri, so I want to get the score. I'm going to try this get invocation out. I'm going to do that medieval execute. And when I do the execute, what's the score? Well, there we go. Wayne Gretzky, Mario Lemieux, and number 7, Tim Horton, the 3 greatest hockey players of all time. Now, that shows you how to do some advanced stuff with the OpenAPI specification, but what we haven't done yet is have the OpenAPI specification create code for us, and that is exactly what we're going to do next. So the last thing I wanted to show you is how the Swagger editor, how the OpenAPI specification supports API first design. That is, you go in and you describe your API using the OpenAPI specification, and then the Swagger editor, the OpenAPI generator that you can call from a Docker file, I got a tutorial on that, will actually generate all of the stub code for you. So I'm actually going to add a new endpoint here. I'm going to add delete in, and I'll call the delete score method, and it'll return a 200 response code if we delete that resource properly. I just want this code to be a little different from the code I've been working on so far. And with that added in there and that beautiful red delete button staring at me in the eye, I'm going to click on this generate server button, and this will generate some server code for me. And notice all the options. There's Java, there's Spring Boot, there is Go, there is JAX-RS, there's Kotlin, that beautiful island off the coast of St. Petersburg, Scala, and of course, what are we here for? We're here for Python and Flask. I'm going to click that Python Flask button. Something gets downloaded. It's a zip file. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to throw it into that _BP folder, which stands for Beyond Pythonic, which is my YouTube channel that I do with Darcy DeCluder. Scrum Master Guide is behind me there. I'm going to paste that in and say 7-zip. Why don't you extract all of that? And what happens, there's a bunch of code that gets created in order to support a Flask-based RESTful API that has all of those components, all of those routes pre-configured in it. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to say, let's say we open a new folder. That new folder is this one here. I'm going to select that folder. A new environment is going to be created for me. And look at all of the stuff that's up here, including a bunch of controllers. Let's take a look at these controllers here. They've got methods in them like delete score. They've got methods in them like get score. They've got methods like health check, and they've got methods like put score. Where do those method names come from? Well, remember over here, we've got that method delete score, we've got that method get score, and we've got that method put score. All of that has been built in here along with all of the infrastructure to support your Swagger UI, your OpenAPI specification. So if you want to do an API first design, this is the way you do it. You write out your OpenAPI specification, then you download the server, then you're given all of the stubs. And now all we have to do is fill this in with some good Python code, test it out with a Swagger UI, and boom, Bob's your uncle. Now, there's still a lot of code to fill in there, but I don't think you want to see me implement a rock, paper, scissors program. So I'm going to leave that to you. Why don't you polish this code off? Leave me a message in the comments when you're done. Send me a pull request, and I'll give it a review and let you know what I think about it.